Rounding people up and throwing them into a fight must be a practice as old as social hierarchies themselves. When the clan's under threat, it seems reasonable to expect that everyone who's able to should chip in to defend the collective. That's why conscripted military service exists at all. But as so much of our world has changed through countless generations, so too is conscription itself. I mean, what even is your clan today? The country you live in? Your ethnic group? Your gender? Your political tribe? Your football team? It's a complex question, and it's the norm that some elements of people's identity will clash with others. And what does it even mean to be a soldier in the modern world? Is an army chef a legitimate target? What about a drone operator, an intelligence officer, or a civilian propagandist? The states we serve, the causes we fight in aid of, and the nature of warfare itself have become alien to the old romantic notion of keeping barbarians from your village. But the basic invocation seems to be more or less the same. Our survival is at stake, and we need everyone to help. This romantic notion is so implicit in the DNA of conscription that I think it stops most of us from taking the time to ask if it really is such a good idea today. Because with even just a cursory second glance at the lived reality, it seems like a catastrophe. And the more I think about it, the less I can believe that we still tolerate it in our society at all. Let's scratch at the surface a little and see if you agree with me. Let's start off with a quick background to the concept. According to the good people at Encyclopedia Britannica, conscription has existed since at least the Egyptian Old Kingdom in 2700 BC. It's probably been around for much longer, and it's just a matter of definition. After all, you can't have statewide conscription without something approximating a state. I imagine it's been a pretty ever-present flavour to any human society facing military threats. But it's also an incredibly powerful tool to help you outcompete your opponents offensively. There was conscription throughout both the Roman Republic and Roman Empire in various forms, typically for men between 16 and 46. Various Chinese empires had it at similar ages in the same period, and the all-conquering Mongols under Genghis Khan could force military service upon anyone between 14 and 60. And, as you may know, their rampaging conquests killed so many people that the break it gave to forests of Eurasia had an effect in reducing carbon emissions from deforestation that we can still measure today. Interestingly, the practice of conscription itself seems to have always been unpopular and riddled with loopholes to help wealthy people wriggle out of doing anything actually dangerous, if they couldn't avoid being enlisted at all. But, much like sales tax or dental surgery, it doesn't continue to exist because people love it. It continues to exist because it's effective. For Napoleon, conscripting as many men as possible from France and the territories he conquered offered a famous source of power and became a key factor in enabling the Emperor General's military adventures across Europe. As he bragged to Metternich, the Austrian Minister for Foreign Affairs, "You cannot stop me, I spend 30,000 men a month." Indeed, he spent the lives of as many as 1.3 million men on his spectacular journey that saw France turn from this, ultimately, back into this. But while those numbers were shocking for their day, the mass enlistments of the 20th century blew them away completely. At the start of the First World War in 1914, Britain's army of some 700,000 was dying at a rate that was not sustainable. A call for voluntary enlistment boosted the ranks by 1 million additional men, but that was still not enough. That million can be taken as a reasonable representation of the number of people who actually wanted to fight, given that they were offered the opportunity and chose to do so where others did not. But with the famous and horrific attrition of that war, this was still not enough. So by 1916, the conversation among the British leadership turned to conscription. Despite being controversial, there was a protest rally in Trafalgar Square that attracted over 200,000 people. Conscription was quickly introduced, and Britain's army would swell in the coming years with an additional 2.5 million men. These numbers and scenarios can seem so abstract today, but it's really worth working to understand just what was happening so that we can avoid falling into the same traps. Virtually none of these guys had any duties related to protecting their homes or their families. Instead, they were shipped off to far-flung fronts of Europe, Asia, and Africa, very often in places that most of them wouldn't have ever heard of, or would likely not even been able to pronounce the names of. The resulting carnage saw 880,000 British servicemen of that army die, some 6% of the adult male population at the time. And when you think that Britain was only the fourth largest party to that war alone, and that the entire conflict was dwarfed by another war just a generation later, we really start to get an idea of how much conscription enables war to exist at a magnitude that would not be possible without it. And its use by one side both requires and then justifies a commensurate escalation from the other. The Second World War is perhaps the ultimate example of this. The USSR conscripted an unbelievable 30 million men and 800,000 women to add to their pre-existing force of 5 million, of whom at least 8 million died. That's like every single person in Ireland and Mongolia dying today. And they didn't all die with glee for the noble cause. Some 150,000 were shot by their own countrymen to prevent them from retreating. For perspective, 100,000 Australians were killed in both world wars combined. A tragedy that was marked by physical representations in every town and city across the country, and is still honoured with a minute's silence annually. But for all of our physical memorials to war and suffering globally, the tragedy of people being forced to kill and die against their will isn't represented at all. It's barely even discussed. And fair enough, I can understand why a state wouldn't go out of its way to commemorate its own horrific abuses, but that doesn't excuse the rest of us for not at least talking about it more. With just a little thought, it shouldn't be surprising that people who happen to be in a particular physical territory might prefer not to fight for it. And not just for the reasons of pacifism or cowardice, valid as these may be on their own. An ethnic German could be called to fight for France in the First World War. A communist American could be drafted to fight in Korea or Vietnam. Our identities don't map neatly against the passports we hold, but, unlike our other held identity markers, whether political, religious, linguistic or ethnic, only the states we live in can force us into their armies, perhaps to kill and die in the interests of that state. But do we really think that, say, all Brazilians are the same? That every Pakistani shares the values and interests of the state of Pakistan? It would be an absurd proposition to make in peacetime, and broadly, nobody makes it. But, curiously, once conflict breaks out, we seem so tempted by the trap of thinking that a people can be described by their nationality. And more, we so often seem to declare an entire nation's population as exclusively desirable or undesirable as a result. If you think that seems like an exaggeration, or the type of black and white thinking that only rabid nationalists succumb to, I suggest you think again. With very little pushback, we've banned citizens from Russia and Belarus from international sporting competition since February 2022, when the Russian army marched into eastern Ukraine. I know I'm probably more or less alone in this, but it really frustrates me as a humanist and a sports fan. What does someone like Andrei Rublev think about NATO expansion, for example? And if he thinks differently from, say, Boris Johnson, is that sufficient to ban him from tennis tournaments? For what it's worth, Rublev has publicly advocated for peace on multiple occasions, but, like his fellow nationals, he was banned from Wimbledon in 2022. Similarly, as a music fan, I don't want to see Israeli singers banned from competing in the Eurovision Song Contest, which is an outcome that many are right now agitating for. I really want both the Russo-Ukrainian and Israeli-Hamas wars to end. I also understand that we give great symbolic power to celebrity, which has an impact on what is and isn't legitimate. But I can just never agree with equating individuals as their states and treating them as though they are. I feel that that's exactly the fuel that feeds such conflicts in the first place. It's not just about avoiding lumping everyone in as evil either. It's also a trap to assume that everyone on our chosen team is automatically virtuous. There was a recent absurd and tragic example in the Canadian Parliament, which rose in unison to give a standing ovation to an aged Ukrainian war veteran who'd stood up, heroically, to defend his country from the evil Russians in World War II. Unfortunately, and astonishingly, nobody realised until it was too late that he was doing so as part of Hitler's Waffen-SS. A standing ovation for a living SS soldier in a Western Parliament in 2023. And I don't want to fall for the same trap. Maybe Yaroslav Hunka wasn't involved in the crimes of the SS and he was a virtuous guy. People are complex and shouldn't be reduced to their national allegiances alone. In fact, it's very likely that any two soldiers from opposing armies will have more in common with each other than with the leaders who send them to fight. They're probably closer by far in age, class, day-to-day chores, and emotional experiences in the world. Yet these two soldiers, through the absurdity of conscription, instead may find themselves taking opposing sides in a firefight and trying to kill each other. It will also be the case that opposing soldiers will routinely find themselves having more in common with their enemy than their leaders when it comes to principles and ideology. How do you yourself feel about the following statements? Taiwan must never join with China. All nations should unite under communism. Venezuela should open their oil fields to Western companies. West Papua should be independent from Indonesia. There must not be an Islamic state within Nigeria. Do you assume that your opinion on any of these is the same as everyone else on your street? More likely, it's not even the same within your own house, if people think about such things at all. When thinking of the government in your country today, do you generally support the decisions your government makes? Do you have faith in their capacity to make good choices that ultimately put your well-being first? I imagine that on the above questions, most people, no matter what their opinion is, don't care enough to kill or die for any of it? And these questions might seem abstract to you, but are they so different from those that so many men were asked to die for in the last century? Poland must not be occupied by Germany. Vietnam must not be united under North Vietnam because all of Southeast Asia will fall to communism. It is Britain, not the Turks, who should control Istanbul and the Dardanelles. These causes are all very abstracted from the daily lives of the tens of millions who died for them. Just as states rarely build monuments to their errors, I suspect the rest of us don't talk about these tragedies in terms of their absurdity out of some mark of respect. It is considered disrespectful to dismiss something as pointless when so much was sacrificed for it. But I think the exact opposite should be true. After all, if you became really ill after eating a bright blue mushroom in the forest, you'd want to warn everyone else that you care about not to eat that mushroom. Can you imagine having chosen not to fight for a cause, being compelled to by law, to kill other people for it, maybe dying yourself in the process? I hope that in your life the idea of being forced to do any of this feels as alien as it does to me. Unfortunately, it's not a hypothetical for the tens of millions who, having been conscripted and killed, can't leave a full review of their experience for the rest of us to consider in how we design our society. Nor is it hypothetical for the millions who are now in the service of the 85 countries that have compulsory military service in 2024. I don't have to go beyond my immediate family to find people who have been conscripted and lost their lives for causes they had absolutely no interest in. While being just beyond most of our daily memories, it could easily come back into vogue, and is at least hypothetically much closer than you might think. Wherever you're watching from right now, it's far more likely than not that your country could conscript you today if it really wanted, without even changing any existing laws. I live in Budapest, and as a chatty guy, I regularly meet Ukrainian men that live here now. But in order to be here at all of these men have managed, in one way or another, to avoid the ban on men between 18 and 60 from leaving Ukraine. This ban was put in place early in the current conflict and exists solely to keep up the pool of available manpower for the war. When you sympathise with a cause, it can be tempting to think that everyone would want to fight for it, but of course that's absolutely not the case. And it seems to be barely interrogated. I think that this is because conscription itself is just so normalised as a concept. The clearer it becomes that large cohorts of people don't want to be conscripted, the further the arm of the state reaches to secure conscripts. There's endless camera phone footage now of men in Ukraine being press-ganged into conscription that I think is too disturbing to share here. But it's genuinely shocking stuff, and I've seen a lot of it. People being grabbed from cafes, markets, rounded up on the streets, often kicking and screaming, with their friends and family fighting to prevent them from being dragged off. It's horrifying stuff. This more visible reluctance to fight is the tip of an iceberg that's seen many more men try to exploit loopholes to either be declared unfit for service there or flee the country. Yet these trends aren't taken as evidence that forcing people to fight and die is a problem, but instead it results in escalating punishment of those responsible for allowing them to slip through the nets. Despite the growing examples of people fleeing and seemingly voting with their feet by choosing to leave instead of fight, Europe's regional director for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Leclerc, recently said that Ukraine has every right to mobilise its population, including refugees of fighting age residing abroad. That's the Commissioner for Refugees. In this conflict, as in those mentioned before, you have to wonder, does the existence of conscription allow for conflicts to continue further than they otherwise would be able to? As wars drag on and losses mount, the temptation to reach deeper into the citizenry for soldiers and labour increases, and this current war is no exception, with escalation on both sides. You're likely familiar with the distasteful stories of the now deceased Wagner leader Prigozhin recruiting frontline troops from prisons by offering them freedom upon finishing their service. It's hard to know for sure, but something like 20% of those people were dead within a year. While I was finalising this script, my phone sent me a push notification saying that Burkina Faso are using conscription as a weapon to punish and silence its critics. Again, it's the normalisation of this practice that keeps something so horrific as a relatively minor story compared to us all knowing about, say, the outright kidnap and murder of a citizen, which is, for some reason, considered more egregious. War is hell. Death is terrible. What are we learning here? Well, I think there's a strong case to be made that it is conscription itself that provides an irreplaceable fuel to escalate all of the conflicts in which it is used, and that forcing people to participate in them, by definition against their preference, is shockingly inhumane. Not only to the participants whose lives are altered beyond imagination, but to the conflicts themselves, which only escalate and endure. The closest practice I can think of to compare it with is slavery. It temporarily is at least that, losing your liberty and being forced to work. Except, I think that even slavery is a preferable fate, given the vastly reduced chance of being killed. I'm naturally attracted to the realist schools of geopolitics, where conceptions of morality, rights, and laws are always secondary to the core power or interests of any actors. As such, I'm no romantic, and I don't expect that making conscription illegal would end the practice any more than it does other crimes. Sadly, I would assume and expect that states that find themselves in existential crises will always find ways to employ some form of conscription if they truly want to. But I do think that the norms and standards that the international community sets have the capacity, over time, to change the appetites for and the consequences of engaging in certain behaviours. Norms change, sometimes radically. I find it hard to keep in mind just how normal some things have been through history that would range from a bit unusual to totally unimaginable today. Truman knowingly incinerated hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians who were just going about their daily life. George Washington owned over 100 slaves. The Habsburgs had so much interfamilial sex that it obliterated their chins. The Aztecs massacred 80,000 people in just 4 days to reconsecrate a temple. All these occurrences sound nuts to modern ears, but they all arguably also passed through the norms of their own societies at the time. It's a sign of how far these norms can shift, and I think it's high time that we consign conscription to the bin. It's interesting to note that there aren't really any international laws regulating conscription. The closest we have are the Geneva Conventions, which establish the international legal standards for humanitarian treatment in war. These have been ratified by all 196 UN nations and represent a good proxy for what are at least the aspirational standards of the collective. These forbid recruitment of children aged 15 years or younger into armies, and forbids the conscription of enemy combatants into your own forces. So there is at least an in-principle nod to the idea that it's against one's quote-unquote human rights to fight for a cause that's against their interests. But the reality is much more complicated, given that people of all sorts of viewpoints on basically everything will inevitably live within the same political entity. And given you're most likely by far to be conscripted by your own government, it's clear that there's a total deficiency of any internationally agreed principles on protecting citizens from the worst excesses of conscription. As I said, I think I'm mostly a realist with this stuff, and I'm sure an international treaty would be just as quickly discarded as any of the others we have. But we could at least have aspirations for a world rid of it. Ultimately, I think that the best bet for improving the situation has to start with a better conceptualization of what conscription actually is. One that does away with the long-dead idea that we're talking about fighters taking up the sword to protect their families from barbarians. That's always still an option for those who do want to do it. For everyone else, I think it's time to put it in the bin and mete out consequences on those who don't. Am I missing anything? Probably. This is a much more opinionated video from me than usual, and opinions don't generally overlap with objective truth. So I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Thanks for my patrons who are on the screen. Most of my patrons here back me for my music, so if you want me to prioritize making more of these instead, join up and tip the balance and I will. You can be sure I've always got more to say about things. See you next time.